Welcome to Doing History. This video will focus on working with historical sources. History is the study of changes in the human experience over time. And you may be used to thinking about history as a timeline of unchanging facts, people, events, and the dates associated with them. You know, the Battle of Hastings happened in 1066. Christopher Columbus discovered the New World in 1492. World War I began in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, whoever that was. And your job as a student is to memorize this enormous and always expanding list of things people did and hold them in your head long enough to scribble them back out onto an exam before you forget them forever. I want you to think about history a little differently. Instead of starting with a list of so-called facts, we'll begin by asking questions. For historians, professionals, and students alike, asking questions is the core of historical thinking and investigation. Think about it, probably the first question that every historian has to ask is just straight up, what happened? Consider yourself to be a detective traveling back in time to investigate the past. You have your reporter's pad full of the typical key questions that all detectives or journalists seek answers to. Who? What? When? Where? How? And why? And for some of those questions, in historical terms, they're relatively straightforward and don't demand a great deal of hunting and legwork. Who was the President of the United States when World War II broke out? What tools did 18th century weavers use? When was Marie Antoinette beheaded? Where was Islam's Holy Mosque built? But those types of questions barely touch the surface of what it means to begin doing history. To start really getting into it, let's take a look at some other more complex questions that might be in your notepad. Who invented the banjo? What were the religious beliefs of Quakers in 18th century Pennsylvania? When did President Nixon learn about the Watergate break-in? Where did the inhabitants of the original English settlement in Roanoke, Virginia go? With a little bit of extra legwork, you can find the answers to these questions too, or at least you can learn about the debates surrounding the answers to these questions. For example, Joel Walker Sweeney is often credited with inventing the banjo in the early 19th century in Virginia. Now, although he was arguably the first Caucasian person to play the banjo on stage, there is a rich and complex historical debate concerning the instrument's origins in African communities in the Caribbean in the 17th century and even further back in West Africa. But still, even after you've collected all of your data to answer these fundamental questions, your work as a historian has only just begun. To get your hands really dirty and deep into the soil of history, you have to ask the toughest questions of all. How? And most importantly, why? Just posing the how and why questions should make it immediately apparent that there is much more involved than a simple gathering of the facts. How did humans develop agriculture? How did Islam expand from the 7th to the 10th century? How did Europeans colonize the Americas? Now, these here are much bigger questions, demanding deeper and more extensive investigation. And it should be obvious that there may be more than one answer to the how question. Certainly, there is more than one answer to the most intriguing, complex, and perplexing question of them all: why? Why did the United States become an overseas empire in 1898? Why did slavery last so long after the American Revolution? Why was the World Trade Center attacked in 2001? How and why are the final and most important questions you can ask about any historical event or development. As you may be able to tell by these examples right here, the why question in particular has no unambiguous answer. The answer to the why question, when you ask it, is a matter of how the historian interprets the facts that he or she has uncovered. So take, for example, the question here about American imperialism. Historians have debated this question since 1898 and have advanced almost every answer that you could think of to explain why the United States acquired an overseas empire in 1898. From economic explanations to geopolitics to pure altruism to extreme nationalism to racism to gender anxiety to status anxiety and on and on and on. When you ask the question of why, the answer that you develop becomes your argument or your thesis. The question why, the answer is your argument. It is the because of history. And arguments, not static facts, are the real nitty-gritty of the discipline. Now, speaking of questions, we come to a question that is central to the topic of this video. How do we know? That is, how do we know history? The farther we move in time from any historical event, the fewer human beings were actually witnesses. In fact, living human beings today have a tiny infinitesimal memory in terms of historical time. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years have passed since the first humans started showing signs of being what we would call human. Until we invent a time machine and go back and view it for ourselves, how can we say anything for sure about the past? Just think about that for a minute. A historian will tell you that the answer to their questions lies in historical sources. And there are two, well actually there's three kinds of historical sources that you'll need to consult in order to begin constructing answers to your questions about the past. For simplicity's sake, we divide these sources into primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are the most important pieces of information about any historical time or event. They are the materials produced by the people or groups of people directly involved in the event or topic under consideration, either as participants or as witnesses. In other words, they're first-hand accounts, sources created during the period that you're studying. For example, if you're researching the history of World War I, your primary sources would have been created in the years from 1914 to 1920. They are sources from the time period that you're studying. Primary sources include a huge array of materials. For example, letters, diaries, newspaper and magazine articles, speeches, government documents, census data, and official records like marriage records, birth certificates, death registers, and on and on and on. This is just a small glimpse at the kinds of things that we can use as primary sources. And as you can see from looking at this list right here, primary sources are most often written documents, but they can include also non-written sources. For example, primary sources might include works of art, films, recordings, household objects and clothing, tools, etc., and so on. We can also include, for recent history and for older history, oral sources that can be used as primary evidence. So for example, interviews with war veterans about their experiences or testimony from survivors of the Holocaust. Oral histories could be considered primary sources. The key to what makes these primary sources is that they provide first-hand insights into the thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, and experiences of the people of the past. Such sources are the first and most crucial pieces of evidence that we use to understand and evaluate history. They are a proof that history happened. Now, as a student of history, you'll also need to use secondary sources. Unlike primary sources, secondary sources are texts that are written or created by people who were not eyewitnesses to the events or period in question. Instead, they were authors. The authors of secondary sources synthesize, analyze, and interpret primary sources. Such sources were written later, usually much later, by scholars and others investigating the past. Who writes secondary sources? Well, mostly historians. Every book or article written by a historian is a secondary source, in which the author has used primary sources and other secondary sources to create an account of the past. Historians write a lot, and they write about any and everything. For example, here's a recent book about Ronald Reagan by historian H.W. Brands. Here's a book by historian Pekka Hämäläinen about the Comanche Empire in North America. And here's a recent book by historian Jill Lepore on the secret history of Wonder Woman. There is nothing that human beings have ever done in the past that historian is not game for historians to write about. Scholarly work in other fields besides history also can be used as secondary sources if they're appropriate. So anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, literary critics, and many, many more scholars also use primary historical sources to build arguments that are useful to historians. In addition, popular writers and journalists may also write books and articles that a student of history can draw on. However, for academic papers and assignments, your best bet is to consult scholarly works, not popular ones. Almost every history class has at least one standard example of a secondary source, and that's your course textbook. Your textbook was written by one or more likely many historians who have pulled together an enormous amount of primary and secondary research to deliver the most up-to-date version of the history of the course subject. And as a special note, there's something that we call tertiary sources. That's the third degree of sources that you should recognize as a student of history. You'll often encounter this third type of source. The most common example of a tertiary source is reference books like dictionaries or encyclopedias. Unlike secondary sources which reflect new research, these sources tend to be syntheses of other secondary sources, and they can be useful to get you started in your research. For example, online you have a source like Wikipedia. It can be really helpful to get kind of moving along and get some ideas and moving in the right direction. But tertiary sources like encyclopedias and wikis are not acceptable as citations in academic papers, at least not yet. You're going to be evaluating both primary and secondary sources in most history classes. And when you do, instead of reading the document passively, approach the source critically. Study and read the primary source as an investigator with a list of questions that you need answers to. Start with the basics. What is the source? Is it a letter, a speech, a pamphlet, an advertisement? What? Who is the author? Beyond just knowing the name of the author, who is the person? Is it a president, a sweatshop worker, a slave, etc.? When was the source written? You're going to need to locate that source in time because that's what history is all about. Where is the source from? Why was it written? That is, what is the purpose of the source? And who was the intended audience? Was this a speech delivered before wealthy financiers? Was it a department store catalog directed at middle-class women? Was it a labor union pamphlet written for railroad workers? Determining the motive of and audience for the source is going to affect your evaluation of it.
Now, those are the basics. This is what you want to figure out really even before you start reading the source, in order to really understand what you're reading, instead of just diving into the text. Identify these things as quick as possible, so then you can go into it with some idea of what you're looking at. But now for the key question, the thing that's really going to turn your primary source analysis into good historical analysis. There you have the basics. What, who, when, where, why. You want to try to nail these things down even actually before you start reading the primary source itself, so you can know what you're looking at. And it'll help you understand what you're reading a lot more to have these kind of questions identified. But now comes really the key question here. What was the historical context in which the source was written? That is, what was happening at that time and place? What do you need to know about the time and place in which the source was written in order to really understand it? This is a really important question. It's the key question when you're doing history. And it also requires some research to answer, but it leads to the much more substantial analysis. So to show you what critical analysis of a primary source looks like in practice, let's take an example here. Here we have the text of an address, that is a speech. If that was all I told you, you wouldn't be able to say very much about this as a source at all. So I'll start filling in some of the basics. The address was written by George Washington, and it was first published on September 19th, 1796 in Philadelphia's newspaper, the Daily Advertiser. So you can get all this information really quick. You have a much better idea of what you're looking at when you know this data. Now for the big question of why. Well, if you know this date in American history, 1796, you'd know that this was the last year that Washington was President of the United States. And indeed, this was his farewell address to the nation, written to leave behind his parting advice to the country based on his long career as military commander and president. Now, again, this is all just the basics. Now we want to move into some critical analysis. And to do that, let's take some quotes from the address. So you already know this basic information. Now you start reading it. And you see text like this: the name of American, which belongs to you, in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. You can forgive George Washington for his old English style here. Sometimes takes a little effort to translate it into modern English. Another quote: the very idea, the power, and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. Okay, so think about these quotes as I read them. Finally, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. Now, here are just three quotes. You can read these and you can do a very surface analysis of these lines. You could say, yeah, sure, Washington is encouraging Americans to be patriotic, to be loyal to the government, to avoid foreign entanglements. All that is fine, and it's accurate, but it's not historical analysis. All it's doing is analyzing what the words say and what they mean. It's not putting it in its historical context. A historian will read these lines and ask historical questions like, why is Washington saying these things at this particular time? Or what does his speech tell us about American politics in the mid 1790s? To do this, you do a little research. You have to know some of the context. You have to go beyond just reading the primary source and look at secondary sources to understand what was going on when the source was written. And you do a little research and you find out that Washington was coming to the end of a very turbulent period in American history. It wasn't at all clear that Americans were going to pledge their main loyalty to the national government created by the Constitution in 1789. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry before the founders, united in the American Revolution against Britain, immediately fought with each other over the future of the nation, almost against the wishes of everyone involved. Political parties emerged, causing division and conflict in American government. And Americans were divided in their loyalties, some pledging number one allegiance to the Federal Republic, others devoted to their individual states, considering themselves to be Virginians or Bostonians or South Carolinians first and foremost before being Americans. Knowing this adds an entirely new level of understanding to what this document actually means. When Washington talks about loyalty to the nation above all other local discriminations, the political party battles and the struggles between local, state, and national allegiance is the specific context of his remarks. His worry that Americans will not dedicate themselves to the nation is based on his personal experience of patriotism to individual states, or what he calls local discriminations. In fact, in 1791, during his first term as President of the United States, open rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania against the first federal tax levied on the grain used to make whiskey. American farmers in Pennsylvania insisted that they had the right to refuse the payment of the whiskey tax, just as they had resisted British tax laws in the lead up to the American Revolution. And just as in the American Revolution, these tax resistors used violence and intimidation against federal officials, with 500 armed men attacking the home of local Inspector John Neville. Now, what was Washington's response to this whiskey rebellion? Well, he got on a horse and personally led a militia of 13,000 men into Pennsylvania to put down what he saw as an insurgency. His show of force was decisive, and the rebels backed down, with only 20 of them arrested. Now, knowing about this historical event, the Whiskey Rebellion, it's now very clear what he's referring to when he spoke about the duty of every individual to obey the established government. He felt the need to warn Americans that now that the Constitution had been established, that is, the government of the people, Americans must obey the government. Why did he say this? Because he saw with his own eyes armed insurrection against the whiskey tax. Now, all throughout Washington's presidency, the new and fragile nation faced hostility from Spain on its western borders and threats of war from both France and Britain. And there were deep fears among nation's leaders that the U.S. might not even survive. Indeed, the infant United States found itself in a real diplomatic dilemma when France broke out into its own revolution, the same year as the enactment of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. Most Americans supported the French Revolution, and after all, many Americans supported it. And after all, the U.S. had signed a military alliance with France during the American Revolution. But things got complicated when war erupted between France and Britain in 1793. Having provided critical assistance to the United States in its own battle against Britain, France now expected the favor returned in kind. Washington did everything he could as president to remain neutral in this internal conflict between France and Britain, convinced that the United States was not ready for another war. So in this light, his advice about having as little political connection with foreign countries as possible is not just something he thought up out of the blue. It came from 8 long years of conflict with Spain, France, and Britain that threatened to destroy the new United States. That is what we call historical context, and that's what I want you to be thinking about. What is the historical context of the primary sources that you're evaluating? Now that you have the basic context for the source from secondary sources, like your textbook, it is like you're able to decode it. Language and elements that were confusing start to make sense, and you get a richer appreciation for what the document reveals about the time, place, and people, about history.